Rain fell in hard, slanting lines, slicking the rutted street of Ash Hollow until the mud sucked at every boot. The lanterns in the saloon windows swayed with the wind, their glow casting long, crooked shadows over the jeering faces gathered at the porch rail. Lillian Hart kept her eyes fixed on the ground, but the voices followed her, sharp and cruel, as if the storm itself gave them strength. "Burned out and thrown out," one man hollered, lifting his whiskey tin toward her as if in a toast. "Reckon she'll be begging before the week is through." Lillian clutched her bundle tighter. It wasn't much, just a threadbare quilt, a tin plate, a book of psalms scorched at the corners. The rest had gone up in smoke when the shack she lived in was sold out from under her. Her brother-in-law had taken the money, turned it to liquor, and left her to sift through ash. He grinned at her with blackened teeth as he walked away. Now the women in town stood dry under awnings, whispering to each other as she passed. "Not strong enough for the West," one murmured. "Should have gone back east when she had the chance." The words stung worse than the cold rain. She was 27 and had learned long ago that a woman without a man beside her was as good as invisible in a place like this. Or worse, visible only as a target. Her late husband's grave was 2 winters old, and since then every month had whittled her down. The burned-out shack was only the final blow. Her shoes sank into mud as she stepped forward. The bundle grew heavier with every stride, though it could not have weighed more than a few pounds. She could hear laughter following her like a pack of coyotes. One voice, deeper than the rest, shouted, "Ain't no shame in taking a bed at the saloon, girl. Could earn your keep that way." The roar of amusement that followed nearly drove her to her knees. She kept walking, jaw set, lips pressed tight. Pride was the last thing she had not surrendered, and she would not let it break in front of them. She walked past the saloon, past the mercantile with its shuttered windows, toward the end of the street where the lamps thinned and darkness grew thicker. She did not know where she would sleep, only that she could not stop. It was then the crowd's noise shifted. A silence fell, not respectful, but wary, like the hush that comes when a hawk passes overhead. She felt it ripple through them and glanced up. A man stood apart, leaning against the hitch rail across from the livery. Jedediah Kane. The name was enough to quiet talk in Ash Hollow. He was no townsman. Folks called him mountain man, trapper, loner. He came down once a season with pelts to trade, spent little, spoke less, then vanished back into timber and stone. He was taller than most, shoulders wide under a coat stitched from wolf pelts, face lined and shadowed by the brim of his hat. One hand rested on the rail, scarred and rough as if carved from oak. His eyes were the kind that measured without showing measure. He didn't join in the laughter. Didn't look away either. He simply watched as Lillian trudged forward, mud sucking at her shoes, bundles slipping in her arms. Someone muttered near the saloon door, "Can't believe he's even looking. She ain't worth his trouble." But Kane's gaze stayed steady. Lillian stopped when she reached him. Not by choice. Her legs had carried her so far, but now they trembled, unsure. She lifted her chin, though water streamed from her hair, streaked with soot. His voice came low, steady against the storm. "You've nowhere to go." The words landed like a blow, not cruel but unflinching. She swallowed hard. "I'll manage." "You'll not," he said simply. His eyes dropped to the bundle, then back to her. "A homestead needs hands. Mine's empty enough. I'll not see you starve." The offer stunned her. Not quite charity, not quite command. Something in between, shaped like mercy but forged in iron. She studied his face, searching for mockery. Found none. "I can work," she whispered, voice raw. "I'll earn it." He gave one slow nod, rain sliding from the brim of his hat. "Then come." He stepped off the rail, lifted a lantern from the livery wall and held it out. Its glow lit the rain between them, catching on her wet hair, on the mud streaking her dress. She stared at the light, hesitant. But the crowd behind her had begun to mutter again, laughter rising, and she could not bear another step under their eyes. She took the lantern. Its handle was warm from his hand. Without another word, Kane turned toward the road leading out of town. She followed. The voices dimmed behind her, replaced by the howl of the storm and the crunch of boots in wet gravel. The road narrowed to rutted trail as lantern light bobbed before her. She saw only his broad back, the steady rhythm of his stride, unbroken by mud or darkness. The wilderness swallowed them quick, black pines rising on either side, wind whistling through needles like ghost song. She tightened her grip on the lantern, its glow the only softness in all that dark. When the trail dipped to a swollen creek, her heart nearly failed her. Water rushed black and fierce, swollen from the storm. She faltered at the edge. Cain turned, face shadowed, and held out his hand. Her first thought was that his palm was too rough, too strong. Her second was that she had no choice. She set her bundle high under her arm, slid her hand into his. His grip closed firm, steadying her. Together they crossed, water tearing at skirts and boots, lantern swinging wild. On the far side her breath came ragged, but she was upright, still moving. He released her hand as soon as her feet found solid ground. They said nothing more as they climbed the slope toward timberline. Yet each step forward was a step away from ridicule, away from ashes, away from the life that had stripped her bare. At the top of the rise, the wind cut fierce. She lowered her head against it, and when she lifted her eyes again, Cain stood waiting, lantern glow catching his face in pieces. Sharp cheek, shadowed jaw, eyes that glimmered like stone wet with rain. "You'll keep," he said at last, voice nearly swallowed by the storm. "If you're willing to fight for it." Her throat closed, but she nodded. She had nothing left but fight. He turned, leading her deeper into the wilderness, lantern light spilling over the path like a thread binding them together. Behind her lay mud, laughter, ruin. Before her, dark forest, silence, and a man whose mercy felt heavier than any chain but steadier than any ground she had known. The storm roared on, but the lantern burned steady, and Lillian followed it into the night. The cabin stood like a scar against the slope, rough-hewn timbers darkened by weather, smoke pulling thin from a stone chimney. Beyond it, the mountain loomed vast and watchful, shoulders draped in pine and snow. To Lillian it felt less like shelter than a trial waiting to measure her worth. The lantern Cain had given her still burned in her hand, though the storm had slackened, leaving only the hiss of wet needles and the occasional groan of branches heavy with rain. He pushed open the door, ducked his head, and gestured for her to step in first. She crossed the threshold and was swallowed by the rawness of the place. No curtains, no softness, only a table scarred with knife marks, a hearth blackened by years of fire, and pelts strung along the rafters like trophies. Tools hung neat on one wall, axes, traps, rifles polished from use. Everything here had its purpose, no corner given to comfort. Cain set his rifle against the wall, hung the lantern by the door, and began stripping the wet wolfskin cloak from his shoulders. He moved with the silence of someone accustomed to solitude, each action precise and unhurried. Lillian kept close to the fire, clutching her bundle, her wet dress clinging heavy to her skin. The heat licked at her but did little to thaw the chill that had burrowed deep into her bones. "You'll bed near the hearth," he said, his voice gravel low. "Dry there." She nodded, unsure whether to thank him. Words felt fragile in the air, like they might shatter if she spoke them. Instead she set her bundle down, unwrapped the quilt, and spread it carefully near the fire. Her hands trembled as she worked, though whether from cold or fear she could not tell. By morning the storm had cleared. She woke to the sound of an axe splitting wood outside, sharp cracks echoing across the slope. Sunlight pried through the shutters, cold and pale. Her dress was stiff with dried mud. She rose, shook off the quilt, and moved about the cabin, searching for some way to prove herself useful. A pot sat near the hearth, beans and dried meat resting inside. She remembered her mother's cooking from years ago, before the West had stripped gentleness from her life. Setting her jaw, she stoked the fire, filled the pot with water, and tried to ready a meal. The smoke stung her eyes, the beans clung stubborn to the bottom. When Cain entered with an armload of wood, the smell of burning greeted him. She flushed crimson. "I thought to make breakfast." He said nothing, only set down the logs, moved to the hearth, and lifted the pot with a rag. The bottom was blackened, the food ruined. For a moment she braced for rebuke. Instead he tipped the mess outside the door, refilled the pot, and showed her how to angle it on the stone so the fire licked the sides rather than scorched the base. His movements were quiet instruction, not judgment. "I can learn," she whispered. "You will," he answered, then turned back to the woodpile. So began her days. She rose before dawn, tried her hand at chores that seemed to mock her. Splitting logs left her palms blistered. Hauling water from the creek numbed her arms with cold. Each mistake cut at her pride, yet she returned to the work, unwilling to be cast off again. It was not only Cain she struggled to understand but the boy who lived under his roof. Tommy was 10, thin as a rail, with eyes too old for his freckled face. He was Cain's sister's orphaned son, taken in when no one else would. At first he gave Lillian nothing but silence. He slipped out to the shed when she entered the cabin, watched her from doorways with guarded suspicion. One afternoon she found him sitting on the porch steps, whittling a stick with a dull knife. He nicked his finger, hissed in pain, and tried to hide it. She knelt, reached for his hand. "Let me see." He jerked back. Don't need your fussing. Still the blood welled. She caught his hand gently but firmly, tore a strip from her worn hem and bound the cut. He scowled, yet when she hummed a low tune under her breath, his shoulders eased. For the first time he didn't pull away. That night she sang the hymn fully, voice soft as she tended the fire. Cain paused in the doorway carrying fresh pelts and for a long moment did not move. His face gave nothing, but the silence in the room shifted. Tommy stared at her too, eyes wide as if he couldn't remember the last time song had filled the cabin. The next day the boy followed her to the creek. He didn't speak much, only carried the bucket without being asked. It was the first crack in the wall he had built around himself. The mountain was merciless, yet small kindnesses took root there like seeds pressed into frozen soil. Her sense of belonging was tested soon enough. By late autumn, traders came riding up, bringing powder, salt, and whispers of trouble. 2 men dismounted near the cabin, their eyes lingering on her as she hung laundry by the line. One smirked, tilting his hat. Didn't figure Cain for a man to keep strays, he said loud enough for her to hear. Heat rose in her cheeks. She bent to gather the shirts, praying they'd turn their mockery elsewhere. But Cain stepped from the shed, axe in hand. His gaze locked on the men, cold and steady. She works for her place, he said. More than most can claim. The traders laughed uneasily, muttered, and turned their talk to business. But Lillian heard the weight of his words. Not charity. Not pity. Recognition. That night, as she sat mending near the hearth, the lantern she had carried from town glowed in the window. She thought of the ridicule she had faced, the cruel laughter, and how a single act of decency had cut through it. Now that lantern light, spilling against the dark, seemed less a borrowed flame and more a promise. She glanced at Cain across the room. He sat sharpening his knife, expression unreadable, but the edge of his gaze brushed her as steady as the steel in his hand. For the first time she felt the faint stir of safety, fragile, perhaps fleeting, yet real enough to cling to. When the wind howled through the pines and the rafters groaned, she pulled the quilt close and whispered to herself that she would not fail here. Not with the boy beginning to trust her. Not with Cain, silent though he was, choosing to defend her place. The wilderness pressed in at every corner, cold and vast. But inside that cabin, beneath the lantern glow, a thin thread of belonging began to weave itself through her heart. It was not love, not yet, but the raw beginning of something she had thought forever lost, the chance to matter. And as the night deepened, she resolved that no storm, no mockery, no hard land would strip it from her hands again. The first true snow came down heavy, blanketing the timberline in silence so deep it seemed the mountain itself was holding its breath. Lillian stood at the cabin door, shawl tight around her shoulders, and watched the flakes gather on the pine boughs until the branches bowed beneath their weight. The world looked clean, remade, but beauty in these parts carried teeth. Snow this early promised a winter that would test every bone, every spirit. Cain came back from checking traps with his shoulders dusted white, his beard rimed with frost. He stamped the snow from his boots, set down the pelt-laden pack, and met her eyes with that same steady silence she had come to know. He rarely spoke more than was needed, yet his presence was a language of its own. He was strength carved into flesh, but it was a strength that seemed stretched thin as the days shortened. That evening, as she stirred beans over the fire, Cain spoke at last. Silas McGraw was in town. Asking after me. She froze, ladle hovering. She had heard the name whispered before, carried on the lips of traders who came too close. Silas, landgrabber, bully, a man who saw what he wanted and reached without fear of consequence. What does he want with you? She asked quietly. Cain's gaze lingered on the flames. This land. Always has. He paused, then added, he sees you here now. Gives him another excuse. Her stomach nodded. She had known shame before, but this was different. To be spoken of as a prize to claim like land or stock, it scalded deeper than mockery ever had. The days grew harsher. The snow piled thick around the cabin, drifts burying the woodpile to its shoulders. Water froze in the pails if left too long. Cain spent long hours chopping through ice, setting snares, bringing in meat. Lillian mended, cooked, tended to Tommy, whose sharp edges softened in small ways, though he still guarded his heart like a boy afraid it might be stolen again. Then one gray afternoon Tommy slipped out. Lillian noticed only when the shadows began to lengthen and his small boots were not by the hearth. Panic rushed through her chest. She grabbed her shawl and ran to the door. Cain, she gasped. He's gone? Cain was already pulling on his cloak, rifle slung across his back. Rabbit traps, he muttered. Fool boy thinks he can do it alone. They plunged into the storm together. Snow stung her cheeks, the wind slicing through cloth and skin. Kane's stride cut clean through drifts, but every step stole Lillian's breath. Still she pressed on, lantern raised high, scanning the whiteness. The forest, once solemn, now loomed like a graveyard of twisted trunks. "Tommy?" Her voice tore raw against the wind. No answer but the endless hiss of snow. Hours felt carved into minutes. She stumbled, caught herself, pressed forward. Her shawl soaked through, fingers numbing until she could barely keep hold of the lantern. Then, beneath a pine heavy with snow, she saw him, huddled small, lips blue, eyes glazed. She dropped beside him, heart lurching. "Tommy? Tommy, look at me." His lids fluttered. A sound, weak as a sigh, escaped him. She tore the shawl from her shoulders, wrapped him tight and pulled him close. "You hold on, you hear? You're not leaving me." Kane crashed through the drifts moments later. Relief broke across his face for just a breath before he stooped, lifting the boy into his arms as if he weighed no more than kindling. "Move," he ordered, voice rough. They fought the storm back to the cabin, every step a battle. By the time the door slammed behind them, Lillian's skirts were soaked, her lips trembling with cold. She dropped to her knees at the hearth, piling kindling until flame leapt, heat licking at frozen fingers. Kane laid the boy before the fire, rubbing his arms, willing blood back into them. Lillian bent low, cradling Tommy's face, whispering song through chattering teeth. A hymn her mother had once sung over her, words trembling but steady enough to weave hope back into the silence. Slowly, color returned to the boy's cheeks, breath grew stronger. When his small hand clutched hers, tears blurred her vision. Kane watched, crouched across the fire. His eyes, usually hard as stone, softened, carrying something raw, almost reverent. He reached out, took her frozen hands in his own, and pressed them close to the flames. His thumb brushed over broken skin where the cold had cracked her knuckles. "You near died out there," he said, voice low. "Better me than him," she whispered, unable to look away from his eyes. A silence stretched between them, heavy with more than words. At last he said, "You belong here." Her throat ached, but she managed to nod. The truth of it settled in her chest, warm as the fire. That night, when she finally sank into exhausted sleep near the hearth, she woke once to find herself covered in his cloak, the wolfskin heavy, warm, carrying the faint scent of pine and smoke. He had placed it there while she slept, then returned to his post at the window, rifle within reach, eyes turned toward the darkness outside. For though Tommy breathed steady now, the mountain held no peace. 2 days later, Silas came riding through the snow with 2 men at his back. Their horses stamped steam into the air, their eyes hungry as they looked over the cabin. Lillian felt Kane stiffen beside her, his hand tightening on the doorframe. Silas grinned, teeth white against his beard. "Heard you picked up a stray, Kane? Shame. She ought to be kept warm in town, not wasted up here with the wolves." The words sliced through her. She gripped the boy's shoulder, holding him close. But Kane stepped forward, broad frame filling the doorway. His voice carried iron. "She stays. This land's mine. You've had your say, now ride." Silas's grin thinned, eyes narrowing. "Ain't finished with you. Or her." He tugged his reins, turned his horse, and the 3 men rode off into the snow, leaving only the echo of hooves and the taste of threat hanging in the cold air. That night, as the wind clawed the shutters and Kane sat cleaning his rifle, Lillian knew the storm that waited beyond the timber was darker than any blizzard. And when her eyes drifted to the lantern glowing faint in the window, she prayed its light would be enough to guide them through what was coming. Snow lay hard on the timberline, a crust that crackled under boot and hoof. Dusk fell quick that day, the sky bruising purple above the ridges. Lillian stood at the cabin window, lantern burning low at her side, and watched the last light sink. Kane had been restless since morning, sharpening his axe, checking the rifle twice, his silence carrying a weight she'd learned to fear. She knew why. Silas McGraw had promised he'd return. When the sound of hooves broke the stillness, her breath caught. 3 riders, shadows against the snow, torches in hand. Fire flared bright against the pale world, a cruel kind of star. Kane rose from the bench, jaw tight, and took up his rifle. "Tommy," he said, eyes never leaving the window. "Cellar. Stay low." The boy obeyed without word, though fear darted in his eyes as he glanced at Lillian. She laid a hand on his shoulder, steadying him before guiding him down the trapdoor. Her heart hammered but her voice stayed calm. "You'll be safe. Do as he says." When she straightened, Kane was already at the door. He pushed it open and stepped into the bitter air. She followed to the threshold, clutching the shawl at her throat. Silas rode forward, torch held high, his grin cutting through the shadows. "Evening, Cain. Told you I'd come for what's mine." His gaze slid past him to Lillian, lingering, cruel. "Both the land and the woman." Cain's voice carried like stone rolling down a mountain. "You'll take neither." The men behind Silas shifted, rifles glinting. One spat into the snow. The firelight painted their faces mean and hungry. Lillian's blood turned cold. She had known men like this before, men who saw weakness and carved it into wounds. Only now she was not alone. Silas laughed, sharp and hollow. "You think you can stand against us? One man against three?" Cain hefted the axe in one hand, rifle in the other. "Try me." The first shot cracked, shattering the stillness. Cain ducked behind the woodpile, returning fire. Splinters flew as bullets tore into the cabin wall. Lillian dropped to the ground, breath shallow, crawling toward the cellar door. Tommy's muffled cry reached her ears, tightening her resolve. She would not let them drag him out. Another shot rang closer. Cain cursed low, the sound edged with pain. She turned, saw him stagger, blood staining his sleeve. Rage flared through her fear. Her eyes fell to the second rifle resting by the hearth inside. Her hands shook, but she moved before doubt could root her still. She seized it, slammed a cartridge in, and crept to the doorway. Outside, Silas advanced, torch casting him monstrous against the snow. Cain fought to rise, axe gripped tight, though blood dripped steady from his arm. "Stop." Lillian's voice cut through the night. She stepped into the firelight, rifle raised. Her whole body trembled, but the barrel stayed fixed on Silas. He reined his horse, surprise flashing across his face before sliding into a smirk. "Well now, didn't think you had teeth, girl?" Her breath shook, but she held steady. "One more step and I'll use them." For a moment, silence reigned, the storm of snow, the torch crackle, Cain's labored breath. Then one of Silas's men barked a laugh. "She won't fire. Women never do." Lillian squeezed the trigger. The shot ripped through the air, striking the snow at the horse's hooves. The beast reared, screaming, nearly unseating Silas. The torch wavered, throwing sparks into the dark. Cain used the moment. He lunged, axe swinging. The man nearest cried out as steel glanced his shoulder, sending him tumbling from his saddle. The other turned his gun toward Cain, but Lillian shouted, "Don't!" and fired again, close enough to singe his coat. Startled, he wheeled his horse and fled into the trees. Silas fought his mount back under control, hatred burning in his eyes. "This isn't over," he spat, jerking his reins. His wounded man scrambled up behind him, and together they vanished into the timber, torchlight dwindling to embers against the snow. When the last echo of hooves faded, silence swallowed the clearing. Lillian lowered the rifle, her arms shaking so violently she nearly dropped it. Cain leaned against the woodpile, blood dark on his sleeve, chest heaving. She rushed to him, pressing her hands over the wound. "You're hurt." He caught her wrists, not harshly but firm. His eyes locked on hers, fierce yet softened by something she'd never seen so bare. "You stood." Her throat tightened. "I couldn't let them take everything. Not again." He drew a ragged breath, then let his grip loosen, fingers brushing hers. "I meant only to find help for my homestead. But I found more than I ever asked for." His words were rough, as though dragged from a place he'd kept buried deep. She bent closer, forehead nearly touching his, her tears falling hot against the cold night. "And I found a home worth fighting for." Tommy's voice broke from the cellar door, small but steady. "Are they gone?" "They're gone," Cain answered, his voice gentler now, though his strength was fading. Lillian helped him inside, settled him near the fire while she cleaned and bound the wound. His face twisted with pain, but he made no sound. Tommy crept close, clutching Lillian's sleeve, eyes wide with awe as he looked at her. The lantern burned bright in the window, its light spilling across the snow where blood had fallen. To Lillian, it seemed less a lantern than a beacon, proof they had withstood the dark together. Hours later, when Cain finally slept, she sat with Tommy curled against her, staring at the flame. The storm outside howled on, but within the cabin there was warmth, fragile yet fierce. They had not broken. They had become something new, something bound not by blood alone, but by choice, by defiance, by the fire they had kindled together. The mountain would test them again. It always did. But when she thought of the fight still ahead, Lillian did not tremble. For she had stood in the snow, rifle in hand, and claimed her place. And as long as that lantern burned on timberline, she would not be driven back to ashes.